Thank you all very much for coming today to celebrate Earth Day with us here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. My name is Keith Benish. I'm the Program Director for International Climate Policy at the Center, having joined about 6 months ago from the State Department. We are very lucky and honored today to have with us the co-chairs of the current negotiations in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Ahmed Djoghlaf and Dan Reifsnyder. And the conversation that we're looking forward to today, they will have a chance to talk to us all about the process of the negotiations, how we get from an 89-page draft text of an agreement, is that what it is? 90-page draft text of an agreement to something manageable by December in Paris. Before we get to that, though, I do have a few announcements to make. First is that this event, obviously open to the public, but it is off the record. So if there are any reporters in the audience, any bloggers, we ask that if you want to quote or talk to the co-chairs or any of the other panelists, that you seek us out individually and reach out to us to make those arrangements. But the comments made from the stage, we ask you to keep these off the record so that we can have as an informative discussion as possible. Also, some upcoming events for the Center on Global Energy Policy. Next Tuesday, April 28th, is our Global Energy Summit, which will feature keynote remarks, interviews, and plenary conversations from senior energy leaders focusing on key issues at the intersection of energy geopolitics, markets, and finance. Keynotes include Gina McCarthy, EPA Administrator, Jason Furman, White House Council of Economic Advisors, and the Governor of Colorado, the Honorable John Hickenlooper. On Monday, May 4th, the Center will host the Energy Information Administration Administrator, Adam Szymensky, for a presentation on EIA's Annual Energy Outlook. So look for these events and others on the website energypolicy.columbia.edu. I'd also announce when you go to that website, beginning next week, you will find a new featured page featuring our research on clean energy and climate change. So this is where we will be compiling the research and events that we have done and are upcoming on those issues. It will also include our blog series that we will begin on decoding Paris. So as we see when we go through the conversations today, if you're not steeped in the conversations and the diplomacy of the UNFCCC, it can be a little bit confusing. So we're going to try and translate that and make it digestible, particularly from the angle of how it might be impacting energy policy and the transition to clean energy future. So with that, I would like to go ahead and welcome again our co-chairs from the ADP negotiations at the UNFCCC. And for those that don't know, ADP stands for the Ad Hoc Durban Platform. It is the negotiating group that was launched at the Durban Climate COP in 2010. Or 2011, and launched the negotiating process that will now culminate this December in Paris. Dan and Ahmed have the enviable jobs of getting to guide those negotiations through their final stage. There have been two other sets of co-chairs over the last 2.5 years, and Dan and Ahmed have taken up from them and need to get us, as I mentioned, from a set of negotiating text that's nearly 90 pages down to something that might be a quarter of that length in a way agreeable to nearly 200 countries. And just one point about the UNFCCC, for those who aren't familiar with it, sort of multilateral negotiations are difficult in and of themselves. The whole UN process, it's incredibly difficult. The UNFCCC widely regarded as one of the most difficult negotiating settings of any of them. And just two quick examples. Before I started working on climate change, I did a lot of work on in the International Whaling Commission, where your two sides of the negotiations are fundamentally opposed to each other, with one side being countries who think it's immoral to kill whales and countries who feel very strongly that whales should be eaten. And I spent 2 years in the middle of sort of grand bargain type negotiations, seeing if we could bring countries together in that incredibly tense, dysfunctional, sort of ridiculous. And then I started at the UNFCCC advising the US delegation there and realized I had not seen anything compared to what it was like in UNFCCC. And in fact, that was reinforced to me when a couple of years ago at one of the Conference of the Parties, there was a lawyer there from the UN, from the headquarters here in New York, who advises on a lot of the UN procedures, and they had sent him for the meeting. And at 4 a.m. of the second night of doing an all-nighter, the day after the negotiations were supposed to end, I was standing around talking to him, and I asked him this question about the UNFCCC and what it was like compared to other negotiating forums that he had seen. And he said, hands down, it's the worst. He's like, it's the toughest. It's in many ways the most acrimonious atmosphere. And this was at a time when he was working in, sitting in and watching Security Council negotiations in the early days of the Syria civil war and Russia-Ukraine. And so that was his assessment of the challenge that's now in front of Dan and Ahmed. They will open for us with some remarks, as I mentioned, about the process. And we are lucky that they both are, in addition to their current roles as co-chairs in this negotiating process, individuals with long distinguished careers in international diplomacy, in particular and devoted to sustainability and environmental issues. And Dr. Daniel Reifsnyder is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Virginia, where he is on detail from the US State Department. At the State Department, he served the past 8 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Environment, where he oversaw diplomatic efforts on the climate change, air pollution, biological diversity, and other environmental issues. Prior to that, Dr. Reifsnyder spent more than a decade as Director of the State Department's Office of Global Change, which included him playing leading negotiating roles in the creation of the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. In short, Dr. Reifsnyder has been in the thick of international climate diplomacy since the very beginning of there being a thing called international climate diplomacy. He's also been a research fellow and visiting lecturer at Tufts and Princeton universities, respectively. Dr. Reifsnyder holds a PhD in international affairs and 2 other graduate degrees in law and Russian studies. Dr. Ahmed Djoghlaf has also had a long and distinguished career in international environmental diplomacy, currently serving as ambassador advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Algeria. He was Assistant Secretary General of the UN and Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Prior to that, he was head of the United Nations Environment Program's Division of the Global Environment Facility. Among his other key roles have been serving as the Vice President for the Negotiating Committee on the Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as chair of one of the 2 negotiating committees on the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and as General Rapporteur of the Preparatory Committee of the UN Conference on Environment and Development, known as the Rio Conference, in 2002. Dr. Djoghlaf has a PhD in political science and 4 other postgraduate degrees in government and politics. So, with that, the 4 degrees will begin, and Dr. Djoghlaf, if you could lead us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate, for this fantastic and generous presentation. You spoke about the most acrimonious atmosphere, and you told us that Dan was among those who negotiated the convention, so you know who to blame. And therefore, he decided to come back in order to correct the mistakes of the beginning. And the acrimonious atmosphere, I think, was right before January. And in February, I must say that, and Haldor is here to tell us, that the atmosphere has changed. And Dan has said that was a miracle, and indeed it was a miracle. And the paradigm shift of the attitude of the delegation before and after Geneva. And I think Dan will tell you more about that. Enviable task, our job, I don't know. But Dan has said yesterday, I think, a very, very pertinent phrase. He said that the issue at stakes are bigger than us. And therefore we are committed. So therefore it's a privilege and an honor, and distinct honor, to try to bring for me 35 years of experience, and all of them devoted to multilateral environmental cooperation, and then I think a couple of years more than me, on the table in order to assist the parties, the 194 parties, to agree on a meaningful, ambitious, universal agreement on climate change. I think Senator John Kerry, visiting Indonesia last year in February, said that climate change is une arme de destruction massive. I don't know how to say it in English. It's an arm of massive destruction, mass destruction. And coming from a Secretary of State who has been involved in these processes, I think, since the beginning as a senator, it's not a light, I think, as a statement. And it tells us a lot about the challenges that we are faced as human beings, as a citizen of the world, but also the responsibility that we have as each and every citizen of the world, let alone the policymakers and the government. I think the fate of humanity and the state and the future of our children is at stake. I think President Chirac, while addressing the Rio conference, the Johannesburg conference, Rio +10, said that this generation is responsible for the damage that we have done to Mother Earth, and this generation is maybe the last one who has the capacity, who can repair the mistakes or minimize the damage. Otherwise, we will be reaching a tipping point, or whatever you will do, it's too late. So there is not a single country in the world which is not affected by the multifaceted aspect of climate change. Starting with the small island. We had this morning a meeting with the 42 countries, ambassadors, representing what they call the coalition of the small island developing countries. And the president of this grouping, the president of Maldives, has stated in the General Assembly that his nation is a nation under threat. C'est une nation en danger, because with the climate change, they may disappear. Vanuatu has been the first island country to ask, as a country, 10,000 citizens, the political refugee status to Australia, because they may disappear. So you have seen what's going on in California, where the longest and the most severe drought, and also the other extreme event in North America. NASA has told us that the month of March was the coldest month ever recorded. They told us also February was. We are beating a record after a record. I was in Washington at the MEF meeting. I had the opportunity to sit with the representative of Canada, and she told us that also it was the worst winter never recorded in the history of Canadian. And they know what cold winter means, isn't it? And she told me that according to the chief meteorologist of Canada Environment, Minister of Environment of Canada, who is, by the way, the chief meteorologist of WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, they said these trends are, you have to live with it for the foreseeable future. So it's not something ad hoc, cyclical that will disappear. And also 2014 has been recorded by NASA and also by WMO as the warmest year in the history, beating the record of 1998. Out of the 12 last year of this decade, the 10 warmest year in the history since 1861, when we started recording the climate, have been during the last decade. And this with multiple consequences on food security. FAO telling us that 50 million ton of food product will be lost due to climate change. The desertification, so we'll have more and more desert owing to drought. CIA and Pentagon is telling us that scarcity of water will be one of the main causes of the conflict in the future. The 2/3 of humanity will be lacking water, like now in California, where it has been decided to have 25% of reduction of water consumption there, and this will be the trend of tomorrow. Health. I am very happy that the White House, Valerie has informed me that the White House has made an announcement that they are going to look at water, at health and climate change. The impact of climate change on human health. You have 12 million people dying every year, according to WMO, owing to the air pollution. I know in my country we have every year 44,000 new cases of cancer, and the experts are telling us that 25% are only due to climate pollution, and mainly fine particles, PM 210 and PM 2.5, that are causing the cancer. So security, if the Security Council has met twice in 2007 and 2012, sorry, or 2011, on climate change. If the Security Council of the UN is meeting on an issue, it's no more technical. And it means that peace and security is at stake. It means that Chapter 5 of the Charter is at stake, and peace and the security of the world are at stake. If you have heads of states discussing climate change, the last summit of Ban Ki-moon in September, you had 123 heads of states attending the meeting. There's not a single meeting of the heads of states, wherever they are, be it the African Union, be it the G8, be it the G7, the G20, the G44, they discuss climate change. And if heads of states discuss climate change, it means that it's not a technical issue. It's not a scientific issue. It's a fundamental political issue. So therefore, we are of the strong view, Dan and I, that we cannot, as human beings, fail in Paris. And we are extremely encouraged by the spirit of cooperation, the commitment of the 194 parties and their partner, including private sector, including local authority, including municipal leader, to be part of what we call the Global Alliance to combat climate change, which will be born in Paris in December. And the beauty is that there is not a single country today, developed or developing countries, who is against the Paris climate agreement. And I was extremely happy to know that today the New York City has launched its sustainable development plan, which include climate change. I was in Seoul last week with the 1,000 municipal leaders, and there is not a single representative of a city who is not committed to climate change. So enviable job, but really exciting. And I think Dan will tell you how we are convinced with what we are suggesting for the roadmap from now to Paris, that we will be all together in Paris on the 11th of September, meeting history and meeting our responsibility and adopting global, universal, effective and efficient global climate change. So how you are going to change the acrimonious atmosphere that you have created, Dan?
Well, thanks, Ahmed. Let me think about that. After Keith's introduction about the nature of the forum and how acrimonious and difficult it is, I kept thinking, what's a nice boy like you doing in a place like this? It's a very interesting process. It's one, as I think Keith mentioned, I've been doing, and Ahmed's really been doing since 1989, since almost there was before a process. And we were here yesterday at the United Nations talking to a number of the delegates there, briefing them on the session coming up in Bonn in June, and I was recalling that the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly to create an intergovernmental negotiating committee that then led to the negotiation of the Framework Convention was done, one floor below us yesterday at the United Nations in December of 1990. And then the Framework Convention itself was adopted at the UN on May 9th, 1992. Before the Rio conference. So the UN and New York has played a very central role in this issue for a long time. I think we acknowledge that, and it's a very important aspect of this. I was going to say, too, that I was fortunate in many ways to, this is a process that's been going on, I would say, not since Durban, but since even before that, since Copenhagen. It really began there with the Copenhagen Declaration. There were a number of different understandings reached there. I'd say understandings instead of agreement because that's a technical term, but a number of understandings reached, and we've been on this road for a number of years. I was privileged to co-chair the previous group called the Ad Hoc Group on Long-Term Cooperative Action in the year that up to Cancun, which was the conference, an important conference, the first one after Copenhagen. And then I was able to chair it in the year between Cancun and Durban. So I've kind of been around this a bit, although it's very different now, frankly, than it had been even then. It evolves and transforms over time. So we've also then had 3 more conferences of the parties. We had Doha, we had Warsaw, we had Lima. We're coming up now on this conference in Paris. And I was talking earlier today and saying to people, this is a very unusual process for a multilateral negotiation. Let me describe to you some of the ways I think it's a bit unusual. Normally you'd have a chair who would run the process. I mean, most things, law of the sea, a number of other things have had a chair who's begun at the beginning and carried it through to the end. This is a strange process because we have co-chairs. Now, what does that tell you about the trust that people have in each other and what's going on? That's just a hallmark, I think, of things. We also have had, we're the third set of co-chairs because the first set came from Norway and India for the first year and a half or so, and then we had a set of co-chairs in the past 12 months or 18 months, I think it was, from the European Commission and Trinidad and Tobago, and now we are from the United States and Algeria. So that's an interesting aspect of this. We have, I say it began in Copenhagen because we have the Green Climate Fund, which was pledged in Copenhagen and has now been established in Songdo, Korea, and has had meetings. It's been organized. We've had pledges last year of $10.2 billion to this fund. That is already in play. Just last month, we had the first intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs as they're known. These are the pledges that countries are making in terms of what they will do in terms of mitigating, by and large, mitigating their emissions of greenhouse gases, which essentially means avoid, reduce, or sequester. And also some are putting in adaptation pledges as well into these INDCs. We've had a number of institutions created along the way. Normally, this is something that would happen during a negotiation, not beforehand. We've had the Technology Executive Committee, for example, set up. We've had the Climate Technology Center and Network set up. We've had the Adaptation Committee established. We've had a Standing Committee on Finance established. All of these things have happened before we've gotten to the final negotiation. So it's a little unusual that you'd put all these things on the table before you get to the end point. So the question is, well, what are we going to do in Paris? How will it differ from what we've done so far? How will it be at once a giant step and yet avoid creating expectations that cannot be fulfilled? Most people are saying, well, we have grave doubts that the pledges that will be tabled will keep us below the 2-degree goal that people have, 2 degree or much less 1.5 degrees that people have been calling for, that the science is saying is perhaps the safe level of emissions or greenhouse gas concentrations ultimately. I think one of the several important aspects of Paris to me are that this, in the Durban platform decision, it called for an agreement applicable to all. And this is going to be, as we understand it, an agreement where all parties will be making pledges, commitments, contributions. I don't know what we're ultimately going to call them, but everybody's going to have an oar, some a bigger one, some a smaller one, but we're all pulling in the same direction. Another aspect of it that I think is important is the fact that adaptation has been recognized. Ahmed often says that adaptation and mitigation are like his 2 legs. You can't walk forward without both. And I think the recognition that adaptation, no matter how much we mitigate, countries are going to need to adapt to the impacts of climate change that are already occurring, and adaptation's profile is going to be raised significantly, as it already has been in the Green Climate Fund, where half of the money pledged is going to go on a grant equivalent basis to adaptation. So half to mitigation, half to adaptation. Let me just give you a flavor of where we are and what's going to happen. We had one session already in Geneva in February of 6 days. In 6 days, we were able to take a 39-page elements text that came from the Lima meeting in December, and we were able to convert that into what we're calling the negotiating text for this session. Now, we were able to do that in record time. We got it done. Parties agreed. We were able to go forward. It was a small miracle in many ways. And the atmosphere generated in Geneva was unbelievably good and positive. And we were very gratified and very hopeful as a result of that. But when you look at this text of 90 pages, it's in many ways pulls together all the different views of the different countries. So we haven't really resolved those views. We've just put them together. And so now the task that we have is taking the different options, the different ideas, and trying to say, okay, well, how do we consolidate this text? How do we refine the options? How do we begin to identify the real issues and begin to move forward? That is really our task in June. In June, we will have a 10-day meeting, 6 days the first week, essentially, and 4 days the second. But we're constrained by a number of things I should just mention to you. We're constrained by the fact that we are one body meeting, but we will have the other bodies under the Framework Convention also meeting. We have the subsidiary body for implementation, the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, a huge plate of issues under the convention broadly that have to be taken up. We're also constrained because countries worry about how many groups we have. Many countries come with small delegations. They can't field people to 10 different groups at the same time. We've been told you guys can have 2 groups, period, 2 official groups meeting at any one time. That constrains us a lot because they also say, oh no, wait a minute, and you can only meet between 10 and 1 and 3 and 6. Because we need time, we countries need time to coordinate in our groups. And that's a very important aspect of this, which we acknowledge. So 2 groups operating between 10 and 1 and 3 and 6 over a 10-day period in June to take 90 pages and get it into some manageable shape. That's kind of what we're facing. Other constraints we face are that we think it's time for the parties to begin facing each other in these negotiations. Maybe instead of having everyone sitting where you are now and facing us, it's important for them to be facing each other, just psychologically, to be negotiating with each other. And there are constraints on the sizes of the rooms and the tables and so forth. That's a problem. The fact that I mentioned the fact these other groups are meeting. So there are a number of things like this that are constraining us. But what people are expecting is rather large. They want us to essentially end up with agreement in June on a negotiating text that is truly a negotiating text and not an assemblage of different views, but a text that really helps us move forward. They want us to separate out what would be in an actual agreement text and what might be in a decision that comes out. And I would also add, there's some things we won't be able to do in Paris no matter what we do because we simply don't have time. We can't elaborate detailed guidelines for various aspects of this. There's going to have to be a number of work plans that go forward from Paris into the future. So we've got to separate things into 3 pots: agreement, decision, and work plan. That's another task we face. They want us to have a short, focused text. They want to have a vision of where we go from here. I should just mention, after June, we will have 2 more negotiating sessions on the road to Paris. One from August 31st to September 4th, 5 days. Another one from October 19 to 23rd, again 5 days. And then bang, we're in Paris where we have 10 days. A total of, we have for us 20 days of negotiations to deal with this. So that's not a lot. And meanwhile, we have 100 and I lose track. Halder, how many parties is it really? You're the official keeper of the number, right? Less than 200. Okay, we have a lot of parties. And reaching agreement among all those parties with their different perspectives and different views is a very complicated process. But our goal is to be open, to be transparent, to be clear, to be fair, and to not have any surprises. We tried very hard in this process to be as transparent and clear and fair as we possibly can be. And I think it showed in Geneva in February. We were very fortunate there. And that spirit, I think that good spirit, it's something that can be lost very quickly. People say, oh, you're doing a great job. I say, yeah, but that was one meeting, folks. We got 4 more opportunities to step on a banana peel this year. And it's really true. I mean, you got to be, it's something that can be lost almost instantly if you're not careful. So we're negotiating our way forward carefully We want to do it with everybody on board, with the concurrence of all the parties. It is a party-driven process. We believe in that, and we want to try to build that sense of fairness, that sense of trust and confidence that is so critical to the outcome. So I'll just stop with that at this point.
Thank you both very much for that. I'll do two questions for you both before we invite our other panelists up here, and one to continue a little bit about the process, which is, you just described you have 20 actual negotiating days left, of 6 hours in each of those days for the official negotiations. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the progress that's actually made in those sessions, the balance between giving everybody their say in the formal negotiating session, and then all the other massive diplomatic efforts that go on throughout the year? There are meetings like the Major Economies Forum, which is basically essentially sort of the G20 countries plus a few that get together and discuss the negotiations. So they don't negotiate, but they discuss the negotiations. There are other informal meetings that go on throughout the year. There are meetings in the margins of the UN. Can you talk about reaching that balance between progressing things in all these diplomatic channels, but then still having it open to all 190 plus parties, so everyone feels that it is a consensus agreement at the end of the day?
Maybe I could begin on that. So you reminded Keith of several things I didn't say, but and should have. One of the things is that we have a presidency, which is currently Peru, that chaired the meeting in Lima last year, and then that will shift to France. France is playing a very active role, which started even before Lima, I think, working with Peru. We have a very close and harmonious relationship between those two presidencies, Peru and France. They are continuing to work together this year. They've already, for example, Peru held an informal session in Lima in March. Very important session. We were able to have about 40 parties. It was open-ended to all parties, where we could talk about issues like adaptation and loss and damage, for example, a number of other issues. I know the French are holding a similar informal session in early May. I should just mention that the French foreign minister has identified kind of 4 pillars for what we're doing going forward. The first one, perhaps, is what we're doing in our negotiations, the agreement itself. But the second of these are the INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions, because that's really what's going to mitigate climate change. That's the action to be taken. And so that's a very important focus of this year. The other two, one is finance, and they're thinking of finance more broadly beyond just what we're doing under the convention. So they're seeking to mobilize the financial community and financial actors across the board to help address this issue. And the fourth one is probably the most important. It's known as Workstream 2 in our vernacular, but it's the mobilization of civil society, of the private sector, of NGOs, of civil society writ large, academic institutions, scientific community, and so forth. Cities, I should mention cities, because these are the actors who are going to bring about the change. And that is a really key piece of Paris. The French are working very hard to try to mobilize civil society, as Ban Ki-moon did last year with the big event that took place during the UNGA here in New York. There was both the march and the commitments that were made, a tremendous effort. I think people are looking to continue that and to really feature and recognize that as a critical piece. It's not just the negotiation, not just what we're doing. It's really that bigger process outside that is so important. So we have a number of different informal sessions. We have the Major Economies Forum. We have these informal sessions that France and Peru are doing. We have a number of the German government hosts annually an important session known as the Petersburg Dialogue. So that will take place in May. There's a large session that France is convening for businesses in Paris, I think the 21st and 22nd of May. So there are many different processes like this. We are working, coordinating with the French presidency and the Peruvian presidency. We're coordinating with everyone else that we can, that consults with us, because people normally come to us and say, well, what do you think we should do? What would be helpful? I have to say the ADP is not the most efficient forum in the world. However, it is the most legitimate. I call it the people's body. And I think anything that emerges from the ADP really has legitimacy because it involves all the nations of the world. And as I say, it can take some time, but it has legitimacy far and away beyond anything anyone else can do. And that's the strength of this process, I think.
Just to give you an idea of the challenge that Dan is facing, I say Dan because he has the substance. He has been involved in all this. So this process started in Copenhagen. So we are talking about 6 years of negotiation. And we had been elected in December, and the first meeting that we had to play a role was in Geneva in February. So, and the meeting is in December. So I've been given 9 months, and initially 2 meetings, 3 meetings, the June and the January, June, and another one. So we have insisted that is impossible to achieve what you are asking us to do within 3 meetings. So we have asked another meeting. So we have 20 days of negotiation, 6 hours every day. So they're telling us, don't go beyond 6 o'clock, and don't negotiate before 10 because we need to coordinate. So we have 6 hours, 20 days. So it means 120 hours of negotiation, isn't it? 20 multiplied by 6, 120. 120 hours. We are talking about a document of 4,000 pages. And you have 120 hours to do it. So 4,000 lines, 4,000 lines, 90 pages, 300 paragraphs, and paragraph 3 pages. So you have 4,000 lines, you have 120 hours to negotiate. So if you divide mechanically, so it means I was calculating the number of seconds that you have. It means in any case, if you make the calculation, for each line, you have 1.5 seconds. This 1.5 seconds divided by 194 or 95, I don't know, maybe 194 parties in addition to the co-chair. And the co-chair, they like to talk. Secretary also. So how you want to do it? How you want to do it? So this is I think the big challenge that we are faced with. So therefore we are seeking the collaboration of the parties, and in order to make the maximum efficient time and also to use the intersessional period, but also Dan has mentioned the facilitator. We have designated 10 facilitators, which will help us to facilitate. They have been selected based on geographical, gender balance, representing different groups, in order to negotiate after the 6 hours and come back, of course, to do it. So it's a big challenge, but we are quite confident that we will be there in December.
And I will actually exercise my prerogative as the person sort of facilitating this to save my second question for later, because I'm confident I will still get to ask it. And with that, I would like to ask our other panelists to come up. Professor Michael Gerrard from Columbia Law School and Professor Scott Barrett from School of International and Public Affairs. If you could join us. And I'll ask Professor Gerrard to go ahead, and each of them will speak briefly. I'll ask Professor Gerrard to go first. For those who don't know, he's the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Law School. He teaches courses on environmental law, climate change law, and energy regulation, and is director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. And he's also associate chair of the faculty of Columbia University's Earth Institute. From 1979 to 2008, Professor Gerrard practiced environmental law in New York, most recently as a partner in charge of the New York office of Arnold & Porter. And upon joining the Columbia Law faculty in 2009, he became senior counsel at the firm. Professor Gerrard has written extensively on environmental law and climate change and has written and edited over 11 books. And since 1986, he's been an environmental law columnist for the New York Law Journal. Professor Gerrard was also deeply involved with many island countries in an academic effort, in a political effort, potentially seeking legal opinion from the International Court of Justice addressing some of the key issues that arise from climate change and the damages from climate change and how it's impacting those island countries. So again, Professor Gerrard is well steeped in the practical of environmental law, in international environmental law, and as an academic as well. And thank you very much. And Professor Gerrard, if you have your remarks to add to what we can expect out of Paris this year.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for the Center for Global Energy Policy for organizing this. I'm going to speak as a lawyer because that's what I am. These agreements are talked about as legally binding, but they are not legally binding in the sense that an American lawyer thinks of something as legally binding, meaning that if there's a violation, you can go to court and get a court to issue fines or an order or lock somebody up if they violate it. The agreements are legally binding in the sense that a country that violates it can be named and shamed, and people can think very poorly of it in the international negotiations. But there is not a real enforcement mechanism. There's not the ability to haul a country into court if it violates one of the provisions that it has agreed to, that it has committed to. There are no monetary penalties. We saw just a couple of years ago that Canada was about to have violated its Kyoto commitments in terms of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, and it dropped out, and that was it, with no bad things happened as a result of it. There are some international agreements that do have meaningful sanctions. The most prominent of them is the WTO agreements, but this is not one of them, and it's my understanding that there is not currently discussion of creating such an enforcement mechanism. With respect to domestic law, every country that signs on is limited by its own domestic law. Signing on to the international agreement under the constitutions of most countries does not expand the powers of that country if it is signing on to the agreement in accordance with its own domestic requirements. So in the U.S., of course, the principal legal authority we have for action on climate change is the Clean Air Act. So EPA under President Obama is doing a great deal under the Clean Air Act. Signing on to an ambitious commitment in Paris would not expand U.S. power. It would not give the president more power than he now has to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And the use of that power is subject to significant resistance in the United States. The last round of Clean Air Act regulations on greenhouse gas emissions was the subject of more than 100 lawsuits brought by industry and by the states that are opposed to climate regulation. It finally went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the great bulk of those rules survived. One corner that affected about 3% of stationary source emissions was invalidated, but the rest survived. It is virtually inevitable that when the current proposed regulations go into final form, they will be the subject of their own set of 100 or more lawsuits seeking to strike them down. And a major question will be whether the plaintiffs, those trying to strike down the rules, are successful in their inevitable effort to ask the courts to stay the rules, to enjoin their enforcement. So there's going to be a lot of legal action in the next several months about that. The other major obstacle, of course, is Congress. Congress, the leadership of both the House and the Senate have vowed to do everything they can to halt U.S. action on climate change. There may be efforts in the appropriations process in the fall to do that. In many ways, the United States Congress is the most important impediment to global climate action right now. The Congress has, to a large extent, been captured by the fossil fuel industry, and this is a major drag on efforts in the United States and globally. in order to get constructive action. It's also extremely important that the next president, the president who will be elected in November 2016, be in favor of climate action, because if that person is not, then they would have the ability to greatly impede the actions by EPA. What the United States needs to do, and what every country in the world needs to do, is to proceed on a pathway of deep decarbonization, of a rapid move away from a fossil fuel-based economy toward an economy based on clean energy. That requires enormous efforts by all of us. There are studies underway here at Columbia and elsewhere to map out what that would be. But as it is now, it appears that all the projections are that the U.S. pledge, the non-binding pledge that the U.S. made in November, and the non-binding pledge that China made in November, and the various non-binding pledges that Europe has made and that other countries look like they're about to make, are going to be on a pathway toward about a 3-degree centigrade increase above pre-industrial conditions. 2 degrees is the objective. It is not a safe level. Bad things happen at 2 degrees. The small island nations want 1.5 degrees, because at 2 degrees they're probably underwater. But in order to be even at a 2-degree pathway, we need to be on a very steep decarbonization pathway. And the final thing to say is that, as all this indicates, is that it's really domestic politics that are the most important in all of this. A negotiator sitting in Paris representing their country is going to be listening a lot less to the eloquence of the speakers of the podium than they are to the instructions they get from back home. And so it's the back home instructions that really count. And all of us, from whatever country we're from, I think one of our most important duties is to try to persuade our home government to take as vigorous action as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gerrard. And just one question quickly for you. One of the topics under discussion that's one of the key issues going on in the negotiations is this question of whether or not the emissions reduction pledges or targets, whatever we might call it, are in the intended nationally determined contributions in the INDCs, whether or not those targets will be legally binding or not on the international level. And I agree with your assessment. It seems unlikely that they would end up being legally binding at the international level. But the question that arises from your comment is, if there is not an effective enforcement mechanism within the international agreement, if there's not trade sanctions or things like that that could be put in there that are the penalty for not complying with legally binding commitments, should we care that much whether or not those INDCs are considered to be legally binding in international law, or does it matter?
Well, the best we'll have is whether there is sufficient domestic support and a domestic legal system in each country to do that. Very few, as I say, of the international agreements are legally binding in the sense that bad things happen. You know, you don't have blue helmeted UN soldiers swoop in.
I have relatives in Nebraska that would disagree with you about that, but anyway.
So I think that the legal bindingness of these that we are facing is the best we're going to get. So I think it's useful to have as strong agreements as we can, and that will exert domestic pressure on many countries, depending again on the vagaries of the domestic politics of that country.
Thank you. And with that, I will introduce Professor Scott Barrett. Professor Barrett is a leading scholar on transnational and global challenges, ranging from climate change to disease eradication. His research focuses on how institutions like norms, customary law, resolutions, and treaties can be used to promote international cooperation. He's advised a number of international organizations, including the United Nations, the World Bank, the OECD, the European Commission, and the International Task Force on Global Public Goods. He was previously a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and a member of the academic panel to the Department of the Environment in the UK. Professor Barrett has been writing extensively about the challenges of addressing climate change internationally since 1989. So since Dan and Ahmed were participating in the process to form the UNFCCC, Professor Barrett was writing articles about, based on game theory, about just how incredibly difficult it was going to be to find a workable solution in the international forum. And so with that, Professor Barrett, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Keith, for organizing this meeting, and for Ahmed and Dan for coming. And all of you. Yeah, so I've been working on this since 1989, and I don't think I've achieved very much, because all my work has been directed at trying to understand how we could actually address climate change, and I don't think we have. So one of the questions in my mind is, do we know why that is? And can we figure out how to do better? And rather than give, you know, it's always dangerous to put a microphone in front of a professor. Mike shows great restraint, of course, but I don't, as my students know. And particularly on this issue, I'm completely out of control. But instead of giving a talk, because there are some people in the audience actually I would like to hear from too. Instead of giving a talk, I like to do is ask 3 questions of Dan and Ahmed. And so let me just go right to that. The first question has to do with where we've been. I think you can't just start with where we are, and both speakers have addressed this. There is no issue in human history that has ever attracted the diplomatic effort that has gone into climate change. Nothing compares to this. It used to be the Law of the Sea conference, which Dan mentioned before, but even the Law of the Sea pales in comparison with climate change. So it's not as if we haven't tried. That's really important to understand. All these hours, all these years, thousands of people, all this effort. It's not as if we haven't tried. But then you have to ask, okay, what do we have to show for it? What's different? Okay, the only indicator that I think matters is not the paper that's written or the meetings that are held. It is what's happening to the atmosphere. The emissions of greenhouse gases have gone up ever since these negotiations began. The concentrations of greenhouse gases have gone up every year. Actually, the rate of increase has gone up since Kyoto. The rate of increase has gone up. So my first question is, why? Why, for all this effort, have we not succeeded better? And the reason I think this question is important is because we're talking about basically an illness. And the question is, what is the diagnosis? Because if you don't understand the diagnosis, your prescription for how to change things will be wrong. So I think that's very important to start with. Now we'll start where we are now, Paris. What's different about Paris? It's actually not very obvious. There is a focus on these INDCs. The INDCs, however, are being constructed in ways that are very reminiscent of declarations, pledges that have been made since the late 1980s. In particular, the idea that countries should pledge in a reduction in emissions from some kind of base year into some kind of future year, where for one reason or another, basically under any kind of arrangement, this is pretty much voluntary. So you're confronting a situation in which there's a deep collective action problem. You're asking for countries to make commitments, pledges, and you're not backing that up with the kind of enforcement that Mike pointed to as being important. What seems to be different to me about Paris is that in addition to the INDCs, there is to be a review process. So in other words, there's going to be an examination of the INDCs that are submitted. It'll be a public examination as part of the process. And not only a review after the pledges are made, but also a review or a sequence of reviews into the future to see, are countries really doing what they said they were going to do? So I have a question. Why is it that you think, or do you think, that that will make any difference at all? I don't actually know the answer to that question. I would like to know if people have actually thought very deeply about it, or are they just basically reaching for things that are just slightly different from what has been tried before, but not fundamentally different. And as a follow-up to that, will this approach achieve any more than the approaches we've tried before? It's very hard to know the answer to that question, by the way, because you don't know what would have happened were it not for the agreement. That's really what you want to know. So as someone who studies negotiation, I can go into the laboratory and I can control for this. You can't do that in the real world, which is the value of the laboratory. How do you know that more is being achieved? If you look at these INDCs, they're in many ways reflecting actually quite large ambition. For example, Switzerland's stands out to me as being quite exceptional in its ambition, but also Switzerland sensibly is looking at trying to get other countries to do the work on its behalf. It'll just pay them, which I think is sensible. It's not a criticism. But in the end, you can't address climate change with all of us paying someone else to do the work. Eventually, we all have to do it. And in other cases, the INDCs, it's hard to tell whether they're actually making much of a difference, could make much of a difference over what would have been done otherwise. So I don't think the answer to that question is very obvious. And my last question is Paris enough? Now, the one thing we know for sure, and I'm going to be echoing something Dan said when we met earlier. So Paris is COP21. The one thing we know about climate change, there will be a COP22, there will be a COP23, et cetera. But what happened after Kyoto was the spotlight was put on this, what in my opinion is an obsession with targets and timetables. And people were not looking for alternative ways of thinking about this problem. I think that possibly the worst outcome of Paris is that people will focus on Paris and then neglect other opportunities that we may need to consider until, of course, we become disappointed with Paris, and then we'll bring out these other things as we have in the past. That's one thing you see over the whole trajectory of these emissions. I'll just point out two things that maybe people should be thinking of. One is a provocative idea that we should use trade measures against countries that aren't pulling their weight. Now, that raises lots of interesting questions, like who's to decide whether a country is pulling its weight? Is this going to pose a threat to the trade system? Might we not only fail to address climate change, but we actually dismantle the trade arrangements that we have? So that's one thought. And of course, this idea has come up. There are actually words in the Geneva document that are dismissive of the approach, but I think the more we fail to address the enforcement problems that Mike mentioned, the more this kind of idea will surface. And the second is there's a somewhat parallel negotiation that's attracting much less attention, but which Dan knows quite a lot about, which is an effort to amend the Montreal Protocol to include limits on a gas called hydrofluorocarbons, which are one of the greenhouse gases. And this, I'm 100% confident will succeed. It will work. And I wonder why we aren't, or should we, or are we, contemplating other approaches similar to that to address other parts instead of just looking under the spotlight thrown by Paris. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Barrett. Ahmed, go ahead.
I was one day in Seychelles, fantastic country, and the Minister of Environment was telling us a story, and the true story. They went for the third generation of environmental education. And as you know, Seychelles is a country that lives and resources through environment, because it's a beauty, a paradise island. And they started decades ago to educate the children about the importance of protecting their environment, because by protecting your environment, you protect your future. So after the third generation, and once the government decided to ban the turtle meat in order to keep this precious asset for the environment. And the people of Seychelles use, by tradition, like for the whale, to eat, to consider the meat of turtle as a delicacy, and especially for festival and big religious. So once a father went to the black market and bought 1 kilo of turtle meat, and he was very pleased to come at home and offer this to his children. and one of his son called the police. And it's not because he hated his father or he wanted his father to be in jail, but he wanted to protect his future. So therefore, coming back to this issue of legally binding, you don't go to court. For me, UN treaty is legally binding because it is supposed to be ratified by Parliament. And when you ratify it by Parliament, it becomes a national law. So you have also thousands of prisons, and people continue to commit crimes, isn't it? So repression is not the solution. Education is the solution. And therefore, I believe when it comes to these fundamental lifestyle changes that we have to, it's not through repression and not to compensation, what have you. It's through education, and these will make the difference. So what Paris will be different is the fact now that climate change cannot be ignored by any heads of states. Climate change cannot be ignored by an extremely increasing majority of the people, and climate change is becoming now an electoral issue. I am convinced that the next election here in this country, the climate issue will be part and will be an election issue. And when people will be casting their vote, they will consider this issue. And I think this is the difference. The awareness about the threat and the need to act is not coming from the top, it's coming from the bottom, because people are seeing the change and want the government to change. So therefore, this is the third day. I cannot find my way and my word to thank all of you for being so present and so many to celebrate this day by talking to one of the most important issues challenging our life, and especially the life of our children. And I want to say a special thanks to Kat, because I have always had a dream to be a student of this great institution, Columbia University, and I failed. So thank you for giving me a couple of hours to feel part of the Colombian community. Thank you.
You're very welcome. We will get a few more minutes.
Ahmed, you could always get a 5th degree.
Too old.
Dan, do you want to?
Yeah, I want to say it's hard sitting next to Scott, A, because he's so smart, but also because he's so depressing. You know? I want to talk about the questions he asked. He said, where have we been? What is the history of this, and what have we done? Well, yeah, it's hard stuff. It's not easy, and I think many people feel, particularly in light of the science that continues to emerge, that there's a significant amount we have yet to do. It's the truth. But I think what's happened, he says, what's different about Paris? Well, Paris hasn't been written yet, so we kind of don't know exactly what's different about Paris. But there are a number of things that I think are different about the issue, particularly if you've been around from 1989 to the present. I was saying today, you can get in any taxi in New York and talk about climate change, and every driver knows what you're talking about today. That didn't happen in 1989. This is on the minds of people. It's on the minds of young people. It's on the minds of politicians. It's on the minds of scientists and industrialists and companies and everything. It's huge. It's massive. I had no idea when I got involved in this issue in 1989 that I'd still be doing this in 2015. Good grief. I mean, no, so it's really big, and it's become bigger, and the spotlight is on it, and I think that makes a huge difference. We don't know about Paris yet, but I think Paris is at least still very hopeful. I'm not as hopeful in some ways about this review process, because that has been an issue before the parties for a long, long time. There is a great deal of concern on the part of parties who feel that the actions they take at home are sovereign decisions. They don't want the rest of the world telling them how to do things. They don't want the rest of the world putting them under a spotlight and pointing fingers and being negative. And you may think that's not legally binding, so it doesn't matter. Well, I can tell you it matters a lot. No country wants to be singled out. No country wants to be isolated and feel like it's not part of a global effort that needs to happen. So the game many times at these COPs is, how do I avoid looking bad? You may think that sounds funny, but it's really what goes on. People don't want to be blamed for failure to act and failure to move forward in the eyes of the world. And it's a very powerful tool. Will this achieve anything more than we've done before? Well, remains to be seen. I think people are very hopeful. I sense a spirit of hope, of optimism, of positiveness about Paris that I've not seen before. And I sense also there's a spirit of realism and pragmatism about Paris. I think everybody feels that Copenhagen expectations were elevated way beyond anything we were able to deliver. And people across the board say, we don't want to have another Copenhagen. We can't afford that. We need for people to have faith in this process, to have faith in what we can do, and they're looking for achievable goals. Now, I will agree completely when Scott points out, is Paris enough? Of course it's not enough. That's why the French are really pushing, and the Peruvians are pushing for the action agenda, the Lima Paris action agenda. That's why Ban Ki-moon had his summit last year. This notion of mobilizing civil society is critical. It's what has to happen. Cities, we were just talking today with a representative who does research on cities. There are many, many actors in the game, and finding ways to mobilize them and to take actions is critical. But also these things Scott mentioned, I've spent a lot of time pursuing an amendment to the Montreal Protocol to begin phasing down, not phasing out because we don't have alternatives for everything yet, but phasing down the use of HFCs. Because HFCs, the good news is they do not harm the ozone layer. So it is where everybody's moving under the Montreal Protocol when we get out of CFCs and HCFCs. The problem is, that's the good news, they don't have any impact on the ozone layer. The bad news is they are very significant global warming gases, far, far stronger per molecule than carbon dioxide. There are opportunities to do things in the near term there that I think are huge. And many, many countries realize this. There's a meeting going on even now in Bangkok this week. First a workshop and then a 3-day meeting of the Montreal Protocol parties where they're looking to try to move forward on this issue. There's some hopeful developments. That India has just tabled a proposal to amend the Montreal Protocol. India had been a very strong opponent of action in the past. India has now tabled a proposal itself to begin phasing down HFCs. We understand the European Union may be tabling a proposal soon, the Africa Group and so forth. So there are very positive signs on the agenda, and adopting an amendment to the Montreal Protocol in November, because they meet in Dubai the first week in November, would send a very positive signal. As Ségolène Royal said last year at the Montreal Protocol meeting, she's the Environment Minister of France, she said adopting an amendment in Dubai would send a very strong and powerful signal to the people in Paris this year. So we're really hopeful that we can see some action there as well.
Thank you. I have one more question that I will ask, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. We will go a few minutes past 6 o'clock since we started a little bit late. So if people want to begin to line up at the microphone there, you can do that for your questions. And my one question is for one person, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, Scott, and I'm hoping you can cheer me up a little bit. And it's just to ask, you've identified eloquently many of the challenges of working on this issue generally, and some of the questions about Paris and what's different about it. And so asking you, what's the one thing that you think could come out of Paris that would be the most important thing for moving us, effectively forward, whether it's closer to the sort of international system that you've identified in your research as being a more effective way to try and address climate change, or whether it's into these other efforts? What would be the one thing that you would tell Dan and Ahmed that they should try to secure in the agreement or the margins of it to be the biggest potential boost out of Paris?
Oh, come on, you're not asking me to be positive, are you? No, the momentum is already there. I mean, I think this is more or less where we're moving is pretty clear. And there's nothing going to stop this train. And I don't think the train itself is harmful. I don't think so at all. I think what would be harmful would be the view that, well, we've done this now, and now we can wait another 10 years and invest our time in this process, and we'll be examining the comparability of the different pledges, and then we'll be monitoring what's going on and doing all of this. My main concern at this point is that we keep open and actually work on other efforts that are not alternatives, but can be taken in addition. I think the effort on HFCs is the clearest way to understand this, but it's the easy one, which of course is why that's the one that has surfaced. We need to explore other options. We need to come up with agreements, first of all, that countries will say yes to, and that will result in something real. It's not clear to me what real is going to come out of Paris, and I certainly hope I'm wrong about that. So that would be my key wish, is that we would focus on alternatives. The last comment I want to make on this, and this is drawing on my research, I've looked at lots and lots and lots of global problems, and we do succeed at addressing some of them. The one thing that is absolutely clear is when you deal with a global problem, multilateral problem, the issues that Mike pointed to are exactly right. If you confront them directly, you need to have some kind of mechanism for enforcement. That's why we have that, even at the domestic level, where otherwise our values are very much aligned. But at the global level, with a large multilateral agreement, that approach does not work because of the number of parties, basically. But there are other approaches that work. This is the key point. So this is where I get more optimistic, okay? More optimistic. And that is what the world is very good at is coordination. What the world is very bad at is cooperation requiring enforcement. So what I think we need to do is be open to the idea that there are other, the HFC example is a coordination example. I don't want to take up the time to explain exactly what this means, but if you look at where we've had successes at the large scale, it has always been about issues of coordination. So I think we need to reimagine this problem. We made a major mistake. In 1988, we decided this was all about targets and timetables for missions that take place on a country's soil. That was completely arbitrary and only made sense in a world that was top-down, not the kind of world where you have sovereignty and all the issues associated with international law. So you need to actually take the world as it is. This is what we do in CEPA, Colombia. Take the world as it is. It's frustrating, but this is what we have. This is our challenge. And to look at how we can overcome these basic incentive problems. And that really comes about reimagining climate as a problem that requires achieving coordination. And to do this, you have to break this big problem up into small pieces. And people have to accept that that is something we're going to need to do.
Can I just say one more word along the same lines? Aviation and shipping were carved out of Kyoto. They were given to specialized bodies, which haven't done much at all. If we were to add up emissions from aviation and shipping, it would be about the 5th or 6th largest emitting country in the world. They are both on stiff upward climbs and may soon become the 4th or 5th largest emitting country in the world. I think that is two sectors that can be carved out, and serious attention can be devoted to technological and operational and economic measures to reduce those two very major sources of emissions. And as Scott said, you could similarly carve out aluminum and cement and steel and paper and other large emitting industries that are in international trade. I think there's tremendous opportunity there to reach sectoral agreements that would be associated with trade sanctions and that might really have teeth and have a big impact.
Thank you. And with that, we will go to questions from the audience. I ask you to introduce yourself and state any affiliation, and we'll take sort of 3 questions, and then we'll have them answer. Thank you.
Richard Jordan from the Royal Academy of Science International Trust. Thanks to all the presenters. With a question for Ahmed, a dear friend. I haven't seen you in a while. But is any language built into the document currently or in the negotiations that deals with unforeseen events such as the melting of permafrost, which would release great amounts of methane, and the release of methane, which we don't even know about, that's under the sea if sea level temperatures rise? Thank you.
Thank you. And our next question.
Hello, my name is Hadia, and I'm studying sustainability at Columbia. And I'm also a youth delegate at the Youth Assembly and the EcoStalk Youth Forum. And my question is about where we need to be in terms of gender and climate change. specifically because gender was first formally introduced into the negotiating text of, I think, COP7 in 2001, and it doesn't make a reappearance till last year in Peru, where it was finally a standing item on the agenda. And we know now that climate change, there can be really no successful long-term policies to combat and deal with climate change till we appreciate and understand that it affects men and women differently and disproportionately. So my question to the co-chairs is, how are we prioritizing gender-sensitive adaptation and mitigation policies in the negotiations? And secondly, there's another big election coming up in 2017 for the new Secretary General. What, if any, impact does that have on your work? And lastly, just an observation, the 6 people that have so far co-chaired these negotiations are incredibly capable, and there was an attempt at regional balance, but we've never had any women co-chairing the negotiations. So if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, and then we'll take one more and get to all these questions.
My name's Seth Kirshner. I'm a lawyer with White & Case. This is much more of a legal question. I probably won't get applause, but I think Mike and Scott raised very good points on an adjudication or compliance mechanism and an ex-ante review of INDCs. And I guess it's a question for the co-chairs as to how we got to the point where it's accepted that there won't be a stronger compliance mechanism and there won't be a strong adjudication mechanism like we see in Montreal or even the WTO, because I think at one point there were parties who were pushing for that. And what arguments were successful in getting the acceptance of a weaker enforcement mechanism? And similarly, on the other hand, I think at one point there were parties who didn't want any sort of top-down ex-ante review of their INDCs. And how did we get to the point now where it's becoming accepted that there will be some sort of ex-ante review, and what arguments were successful in getting us there?
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we have unforeseen events, the questions about gender balance, the questions about enforceability. Dan and Ahmed, you have...
Okay, and really quickly, I would say unforeseen events, to my knowledge, that's not been an issue so far. I mean, it's certainly been an issue for the IPCC. It's not been a major issue in the negotiations that I know of, and perhaps others who've been closer to this over time do, but I don't think we've had a major focus on it in the negotiations. Gender and climate change, on the other hand, is a big issue. There have been a number of provisions that are in the text now. There's a whole section on this. Where that will come out, I'm sure there will be something on it because it is a matter of great interest to parties, but I don't know what. I'm sorry we're not, we're males. What can we do? One of those things. White & Case, the question about adjudication ex-ante review, very interesting question because you may know that the rules of procedure of the Framework Convention on Climate Change have never been agreed. You know that? I mean, ever since the convention first entered in force, the rules have been applied. They've never been adopted. It's never been possible to adopt them. Why? Because we have a rule of consensus. Now, you can define consensus in different ways. The United States usually defines it as absence of a stated objection, but in any event...
By the United States.
You can't get people in this process to agree to a hard-hitting, adjudicated, penalty-type approach. I mean, good luck. I mean, please come and join us and ask them what they think, but I can just tell you it ain't going to happen. Not on my watch, not while I'm here. Just because that's just far beyond what the parties are willing to bear. Ex-ante review. I don't think we're really there yet on ex-ante review. We've had a lot. This was a huge issue in Lima where parties were saying no ex-ante review. We refuse. We don't want people telling us our intended nationally determined contribution isn't good enough. As an official matter, government to government, we're not going to have that. And even under the Framework Convention, when we have the opportunity, we've always had the opportunity to look at each other's national communications and to point fingers and say, you're not doing well enough. That's not how governments do it with each other. It's just too sensitive. It's too difficult because no one wants to start that process or we could be going down a very negative road very quickly. So it has to, we talked about building incentives, yes. It has to be positive. It has to be full of incentives. It has to be something people want to do, not something people are forced to do against their will.
Just briefly on permafrost and methane, I think the word doesn't exist, but it is sure that the text make a lot of provision that any review, adjustment in the future evaluation, what have you, should be based on the best available science. So I think that this is taken care of. In my past life, I take credit of having developed a plan of action on gender and biodiversity, and I pay tribute to IUCN, who has helped us, and also there's another gender plan of action for desertification. We hope that one day we'll have it in climate change, but I know also IUCN has established a forum on women and biodiversity and climate change, and this forum on women meet regularly. Yes, indeed, we don't have women on the podium, but I can assure you that our boss, the executive secretary of UNFCCC, is a woman. And we are working under her guidance. So you are not on the podium, but the boss is a woman, and I think it's it's the best way to mainstream, I think, gender in whatever we do. Regarding the election of the Secretary General, I think that has no effect whatsoever on us, because it will be gone in 2015. And of course, we very much hope that the next Secretary General will be a woman. We very much hope that the next Secretary General will pay as much as attention to climate change as the current Secretary General, who will go down the history as being the first Secretary General of the UN of paying attention to environment in general and climate change in particular. Thank you.
And with that, we'll keep moving through questions. Thank you to the first three people who had very direct questions, and we'll take three more people. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dave Fishbein. I'm a former local government official in Suffolk County, New York for over 3 decades, was involved with the purchase and acquisition of $750 million of real property out there from the farmlands and stuff, which you may or may not be knowledgeable about. However, my question is an international one. The TPP and the potential enforcement mechanism, which is going to be, it's attempted to be fast-tracked, and it was raised here that Congress is one of the major impediments that's going on this week. What impact, if any, would this have if it's fast-tracked and this defense mechanism is put in where everything is being held by international tribunals of arbitrators?
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Roma Stipravy, President of NGO Sustainability, and my question is, in the negotiations, is any consideration being given to both the peaceful and non-peaceful use of atomic energy and its effects on climate change and on the environment?
Thank you.
I'm Narayan Subramanian with Independent Diplomat. I have a specific question about commitment periods. Professor Barrett alluded to this when he asked, how do we avoid putting something on the table after Paris and not revisiting it after 10 years? As the INDCs have been coming in, we have a 2025 target from the US, we have a 2030 target from the EU and China. How are we going to standardize these targets, and how are we going to... My question to the co-chairs is, where do you see us going with regard to commitment periods? Are we going to try to revisit them every 5 years, every 10 years? And how are we going to make sure that these commitments are actually standardized at the end of the day? Thank you.
Thank you. And let's go ahead, and we have 2 more people to give questions. Let's make sure we get your questions in, and then we will address them all.
Hello. My name is Ismail. I'm from the Maldives, a very concerned citizen about climate change. I have a question for the co-chairs as well. As you mentioned, the whole process is a party-driven process, and at the moment we're facing the challenge of reducing a 90-page document into something agreeable, something more concise, within a very limited time period. So my question to you is, how do you plan to proceed with this, and how do you plan to avoid another incident like what happened in Copenhagen? Thank you.
Thank you. And our final questioner.
I'm Winifred Armstrong and taught the environmental policy workshop here at CEPA a few years ago. What I'm raising is really more for the audience probably than for the speakers, but it plays into many of the comments that have been made, to wit. In 2001, we put on the agenda of every candidate for mayor of New York, what are you going to do about climate change, and proposed the first greenhouse gas survey for which we had already support. They all, when they're candidates, they will agree to anything halfway reasonable. And you then have a leverage to work from there. We are coming up on elections, and this is not just presidential. Frankly, it's almost more important locally. The second thing we did was to pull together many of the bureaucrats in departments of sanitation, economics, et cetera, et cetera. At that point, climate change was on nobody's agenda and part of nobody's job. And in pulling them together, several things happened. They were all interested. They defined what was relevant in terms of their jobs. Job descriptions began to include climate change. There were jobs for climate change or environmental actions, such as you mentioned earlier with the Department of Sanitation today that announced a new initiative. In any case, these are operational and beyond what you're really doing at the UN. But when we worked in the environmental policy workshop, we were working also with business people and pushing the agenda to get to the difference between growth and development, between measures that would define growth only as increase in consumption of resources. And this is something that many people in this room can work on. So it's an orchestration.
Thank you very much for the comments. I think that Ahmed in particular has worked extensively with cities and thinking about how cities can contribute at that international level also. So maybe you could start with a couple of comments about that, and then we can answer the other questions and then close.
Okay. Well, let me also come back because I wanted to go back to the lady who asked about gender and climate change too, because one of the things I've noticed over the years is that I think the United States actually has done a pretty good job of having a lot of women in our negotiating team and our process over the years. I don't think that's always been the case for a lot of other countries, but what's remarkable, if you look at the complexion of the delegations now, many, many, many more women are involved in our process today than there have been in the past. And I think that's why you're seeing this strong push in part for dealing with gender and climate in the negotiations. So I just wanted to come back and point that out. On these questions, I don't really, the issue of how does the TPP, the trade, wait a minute, Trans-Pacific Partnership affect us? I maybe leave that for the legal experts here. I'm not quite sure how to deal with that one. Atomic energy, well, I think it is, I watched in the CSD, and Roma did too, I know, because I remember from those days, we had a meltdown in the CSD over in the energy cycle, precisely because countries could not agree on, different groups were pushing different energy sources. Some were strongly for renewables, wind and solar. Some were pushing fossil fuels. Some were pushing atomic energy. And people couldn't agree. People just really couldn't align their interests. So it was a very great failing, I think, of the CSD when we couldn't do that. But it's not come back up in this discussion yet, although I do think atomic energy, nuclear energy is a piece of the equation going forward. It's certainly going to be a part of what many of these countries do to try to, in terms of their nationally determined contributions. But it's also controversial. In terms of 2025 and 2030, very interesting question, because in February in Geneva, we got a discussion going of the issue of cycles, and in particular, how long the cycle should be and what the cycle should be and so forth. I think precisely for the reason you say, many people are worried about a cycle that's too long. Some people say 2030 is good because it gives clear direction, particularly to the private sector, of the direction of travel. On the other hand, people say 2030 is entirely too long because it locks in a lower level of ambition, that what we need is for ambition to be increasing over time, and the shorter that initial period, the chances are better that we're going to see higher levels of ambition. So it remains to be sorted out in the discussions, but it's certainly an issue in play right now. How to avoid Copenhagen? Also, excellent question. I think Ahmed and I are doing our level best to try to make this, to try to listen to parties, try to have this be a party-driven process, to try to work with parties and have them own it. The problem, I think, for many people in Copenhagen is they didn't feel ownership of what the outcome was at the time. And finally, the question about how things have changed in terms of people putting environment and climate change onto the agenda and at the forefront, making it part of job descriptions and so forth. That's how I see the change that's occurred since '89. That's huge. It's almost too numerous to count. It's so amazing. And whether that plays into this election cycle and so forth in this country and other countries, I have no doubt it's going to be a much bigger issue than in the past.
So thank you very much, and you understand why I hate talking after Dan, because he explained everything and I have nothing else to say. Now on the cities, just a couple of figures. 2% of the surface of the planet occupied by cities and consuming 70% of the resources of the planet, and also emitting 70% of all the CO2. 2007, paradigm shift, first time in the humanity, you have more people living in the cities than in the urban area. By 2050, 2/3 of humanity will be living in cities. And some, by the end of the century, the 90% of the population will be living in cities. And this, no one can stop it. It is something that no one can stop, these unforeseen and dramatic changes. And all these changes are not taking place in US or in Europe. They're taking place in developing countries. Africa alone will be 2 billion people, and African will be the 3rd largest population of the world after China and India. And the 2/3 of the new citizens of Africa will be in the cities. So therefore, engaging cities and municipal leaders in our battle for life on Earth is of critical importance. So welcome your initiative of asking the mayor before being elected on their plan on CO2, because it's, I think, a pioneer job. So I had, thanks to Dan, a fantastic opportunity this afternoon to have a working lunch with Cynthia from the Urban Research Network on climate change. And we have discussed some great idea on how in Paris we can have a coalition of mayors and policymakers to implement the climate agreement. I was in Seoul, as I said, with 1,200 participants, and I thought that it was a good idea to have this national contribution that we called in our jargon INDC, but it's the action plan of each government to combat climate change and to ensure the target of 2% of temperature, which will not rise more than 2% compared to pre-industrial level. Otherwise, IPCC will tell us, is telling us that some part of the world will be just impossible to live. Why not having also municipally determined contribution to assist? We have Gabon, who has just been the first African country, the first developing countries to submit its contribution. Why not the city of Libreville and other big cities of Gabon to prepare their plan to implement their national? Because, and Jordan will remember this as an old hand of Rio, we were fine at that time of this motto of Secretary General of the conference, Mr. Maurice Strong, who was of the view, the motto was think globally, but act globally. I have been part of the UN for a couple of years, and we used to assess a successful meeting by the number of participants at the opening. The meeting was held, and we had such number of participants, such a number of ministers. But for me, really assessing a successful meeting is the number of persons that will stay at the closure of the meeting. So for all of you, and I want to give you a big applause for sacrificing your day and celebrating the Earth Environmental Day by talking about an issue which is of tremendous importance for you. So thank you very much, and Kate, thank you very much.
Dan, I thank you all for coming out. Remember to follow us at energypolicy.columbia.edu, and everyone have a good evening on this Earth Day. Thank you.